Hi, this is Mary Baca with Remotely Unique, and I just wanted to let you know that today's show is actually the conclusion of a four-part series for October, specifically highlighting domestic violence for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Today's show is actually going to be separated into two segments, so be sure that you watch both of them. Thanks a lot. Hi, this is Mary Baca with Remotely Unique, coming to you from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Acknowledging Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is October. If you have been watching, then you're aware that I've been devoting the whole month of October shows to the topic of domestic violence. It is such an important topic, and it's a topic, the name of the series is, I think, The Unspoken Truth, and that's because it is just so accurate to say that so many people are in domestic violence relationships or have been in their lifetime, and they don't validate it as such. And that's something my guest today, she's been on the show before, Stephanie Villalobos.
Hello.
With Valencia Shelter Services. We've been talking about all month, about domestic violence in different ways. And today we're going to cover like signs and symptoms, and also how people get in touch with her shelter. Like, how do they get referrals? How do they see people come through the door? What are the different ways that happens? Self-referral, of course, is one, but there are other ways. So we're going to talk more about that, and just hoping that the people that watch it, I know, and she knows, that there has to be people out there, unfortunately, who can relate to this topic, who have unfortunately experienced these things. And we just want to reach out to you so that you are not suffering alone, so that you know that there really is confidential help. And our agency, Odyssey Counseling and Valencia Shelter Services, we meet you where you're at. And we'll talk more about that, meaning there are no expectations. If you make a call, there's no expectations about what you're ready to work on, or if you're ready to work on anything even. We just want to be of service and help you in any way that we can. Can you go ahead and expand on that a little bit? Because I think just in general with just regular counseling, that's part of the delay of why people put off going to counseling, is because they're like, what's that going to mean? Then I'm going to have to go in every week. People think all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to domestic violence, what are your thoughts about that, about like why some people might hesitate to call for help?
Well, there's many reasons. So I think the biggest one, for sure off the bat, that comes to mind is that people tend to size up what they're experiencing to somebody else. So either they're using like media to tell them what domestic violence is. We've all seen movies, right? And then they're like, well, is my situation that bad?
Right.
As that movie portrayed it to be.
Mm-hmm.
So if it is not, in my mind, then maybe I'm just not going to call because it's not that bad. Mm-hmm. Or people don't know that there's different types of abuse other than just physical.
Right. Talk a little bit more about that.
Sure.
What are some of the other kinds of abuse?
Yeah. The biggest one that I think goes undetected to many is the psychological and emotional abuse that people might be under in abusive relationships. That can be putting you down. That could be making you feel unsafe, either by threats of doing something. They might not do that thing, but they might threaten to do it. Anything, either in the body language, that
very powerful
fear,
yes,
right? Mm-hmm. Or not feeling secure in your safety or your person. Those are everything that can be. That's the root of all that emotional abuse. And it could be different from anybody else. There's some cases that I did work as an advocate where there were certain sentences that the abusive person could say that would put the non-abusive person in this like whirlwind of, oh my gosh, this is really bad. And it's a sentence that I would not have picked up on as being abusive or anything like that, but that person has conditioned the other to know that that particular sentence, word, whatever, means you need to fear your safety.
Well, one of the things, too, with emotional abuse that I think is emotional abuse is if a person threatens to leave the other often. That's very manipulative and abusive because oftentimes it is said with the intention of controlling the other person, right? Because with domestic violence, power and control are really the things that are the part of the abuse. And that's where, like, when people say, well, she or he never hits me, so I'm not abused. And it's like, is there a power and control dynamic? If there is, then there's abuse in the situation.
Right.
So I think people, it's interesting. It's like sexual abuse. And we were talking before we came on with sexual abuse. A lot of people think they've never been sexually abused because they look at that as, it's just penetration or nothing, and that's not true. Like, sexual abuse is a spectrum, and lots of people, unfortunately, have experienced that. That's why I think the numbers would be higher if people, because the stats only capture reported.
Yep.
And there are so many people that don't report domestic violence and sexual abuse and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
So. Financial abuse. I mean, that's a big one. Yeah. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, and particularly now during the pandemic, oh my gosh, is that one coming up way more than normal. It is, so I like to try to put people who haven't experienced violence in a kind of mindset of how much of your financial placement in this moment of your time in their life are reliant on somebody else? Meaning, who's the breadwinner of the family currently? Like, who would that be? If that person lost their job, what would that mean? What would that mean for you? What would that mean for your family? What would that mean for your kiddos, right? Are there people that depend on you that may be outside of, like, your relationship and those of your children? Like, does an elderly person depend on your family, right? And how much of your financial security is kind of wrapped in other people, right? And if one of those people were an abusive person, how would that affect your life? And if a lot of the time in domestic violence relationships, there is one person who makes the money and therefore has that power and control over the other. And if it's an unhealthy relationship, that becomes a means of control. So, if I was an abusive person, I might dictate how much money I give you if you and I are in a relationship, right? How much money do you get in your allowance, whatever. Or if you are...
Even that word, in your allowance.
Yes, that word gets used.
Wow, yeah. It's like, yeah.
Or...
like that person's a child.
Right. Could I dictate then what activities you participate in? Could I dictate also to, like, what activities that you put our children in or lack thereof, right? If I withhold financial money, what does that mean?
Are horrible today.
Oh, it's okay. If I withhold financial money, what does that mean? Like, how do you survive? How do you do this? Or to the reverse of when a victim is leaving that situation, if that person hasn't ever been, like, the head of household before, the breadwinner, maybe a part of the abuse in that isolation is that the offender doesn't want that victim to work because then there's other people that can have interaction with them, right? That's
isolation and...
Right. And so then therefore, like, they have no resume, they have no prior work history, they don't have any, like, real world experience by the time it's them leaving to get be that head of household. They have hard times getting jobs.
And then being told, right? Like I'm thinking about one lady that I worked with, and her husband was the breadwinner, and he used to tell her things like, "You'll never make it on your own.
Right.
How are you going to support yourself?" He never touched her. He never hit her. Mm-hmm. He didn't have to.
Nope.
He had full control over her. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Tearing somebody down in their emotional feelings and their self-worth or their self-efficacy is a big, huge portion of that underlying emotional, psychological abuse. But yes, definitely say in the finances. And so then victims have a hard time getting work, employment. It's harder. Then their kids, to the perception of them, might feel like they suffer instead of just, being with that other person and having that whole family, right? And so then, we see this cycle a lot because they're trying to figure out, how do I be self-sufficient when I have had this conditioning and or lack of resources to be happy and whole. And so then they just stay in this situation because it's easier than getting out. And then the sentence I always hear after that with clients that I've worked with is, at least I don't get physically abused, so it's not that bad.
I know, minimizing it. Well, even offenders, right, don't look at it, well, I've never hit her or him, and it's like, well, that doesn't matter. You have full control in the relationship, and you manipulate with that, and so it's abusive. You are being abusive. And so it's not just the education that needs to happen with victims. No. It's educating I hate to say offenders, because that always sounds like if somebody's been prosecuted, which that's not how I mean it. I mean, anybody who behaves abusively is an offender. And there's different levels to all of that. And then a lot of times there's mutual abuse.
Right.
But yeah.
So those have been, I think, the biggest... the main abuses. There's also religious abuse, so that's another big one.
Talk about that. What is that?
If you are somebody who is really tied to your religious or spiritual belief, cases that I've worked in the religious abuse avenue there is that when they go seek support from council of whatever group that they belong to or religion, usually that comes down to the ties to divorce is really bad. That's usually the message. And so therefore, if you're married, you're supposed to be able to navigate that water and be okay. There's this issue with ending a relationship in many religious beliefs, not all, but many, that it becomes a negative thing. I've had clients so afraid to leave their partner because of this religious part of it that they literally fear like being damned to hell in leaving, because the Bible says, or my religious person says, and this is like our community of faith says. The other thing with that religious abuse too is sometimes the religious base is the only community that person knows, right? And they have strong ties to the other people that go to this church or whatever. And so to leave that abuser, to leave that community means that they potentially lose all ties. Yeah,
I remember one gal I was working with, and I won't say the religious affiliation because, for obvious reasons, but she was not allowed to leave her husband, who was very physically abusive,
right?
Because they weren't, unless there was infidelity, they could not leave the relationship. So, and he was extremely violent with her, extremely. Not that like a slap is nothing, because I'm not saying that at all, but it was really horrific, and she was not allowed. If she left him for the abuse, she would lose all her relationships with the church, because then they would all be banned from talking to her.
Excommunicated.
I couldn't believe it. I was like, wow. And this has been years, but and I've talked to other people like that, but she's standing out of my mind right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that on top of that too, what comes up is the if I do it, I'm fearful for my children, for then or will they make the same mistake? Right? Like if I identify that I'm, regardless of religious belief, I'm going to be done with this relationship and divorce, whatever that means. A lot of clients also have that fear of like, do I put that on my kids now? Like, does divorce become okay? Right? And there's a lot of that fear of what kind of example am I showing to my kids? Right? Yeah. So they're in that religious sector there's so much. There is
a lot, and you never really hear that talked about a lot, not to the degree for sure that it exists.
Well, because for good reason, like, you know, like when we talk about religion or faith-based, like usually that is like to the core of somebody's person. That is how somebody navigates the world. Like that's what they hold to in times of struggle or good times, or, you know, it's so ingrained deeply that, and it's also generationally passed at times. So there's like that tie from like generations of we've done this practice, and now it's starting to, you get to the intersection of like when a violence is happening, but there's no remedy in your spiritual belief for that to take place, and so then your norms and your morals get conflicted with it, and so that religious abuse is a very touchy subject, and some people like very push it away because it's too hard, it's too much, it's too it makes me feel uncomfortable in the body, it makes me feel uncomfortable to think about, of having to navigate like what's my moral compass say, but also my religious beliefs, and I'm in this place where they might not align anymore. And that's a really hard place to be.
It is. I have a question. So with Odyssey Counseling, we're not a shelter service. So we deal a lot with domestic violence, but that's not necessarily the reason people come in. So, you know, we will address the abuse, well, depending on if it's life-threatening at the time, you know, if there's things like that going on. But people can come to us and I think not feel like, in other words, like when they go see you, do they then feel like, okay, that is what they're going to be dealing with because of the nature of the agency? You know what I'm saying?
Yes. I think when you hear the word like domestic violence service or shelter or whatever, there's like a negative, like a key scary feeling that people hear. But what I will say is that, like, again, and I'm relying on my practice of actually being like an advocate and meeting people one-on-one, advocates are trained to create and build rapport. So we don't talk about the bad stuff right away. You know, we talk about, tell me about you. Like, what are some of your strengths? You know, what are you? Who are you? Tell me about that. And then we can get into what the reason that brought them there, if they so choose to. But like I've had many cases where they're like, I don't want to talk about that yet. I just want to come visit you for a little bit.
Nice. And so you let them do that.
Yeah.
I think that's important for our listeners to hear. That, you know, going back to how I opened the show with that, there's not pressure. I mean, you know, a good counselor is always going to meet somebody where they're at.
Right.
And not all counselors are like that, because I've met those.
Yeah.
But you know, most often, I think for the most part, that's how it is, and that's how it should be, where you meet the person where they're at, and then, you know, and rapport is everything, right? Because if you don't have a good rapport with somebody,
right,
it's not going to go very far.
Right. And I think that also, too, with the hotline, there's been calls that I've done and some of my staff have done where it's like, I just, like, want to talk to somebody. And it's like, sure, we're here for it. But I think the importance is to remember is that when you come to an agency like mine, we are federally mandated to keep your information confidential. Through the Violence Against Women Act and through the Victims of Crime Act. Any services that are rendered from an agency, victim service agency like mine, we have to get your written consent to talk about anything we talked about outside of that space.
How's that different from HIPAA? Or is that what you're talking about?
It's not. It's additional. So
Okay.
because of the funding that we as a nonprofit receive, we sign on to say that we will apply the HIPAA guidelines. However, we're also applying an additional.
I didn't know that. So
Yeah.
I want to know more.
Yeah. So an additional confidentiality part of our victim services, because we identify that if any information of our agency gets out to the abusive person, we are potentially putting that person that came to see us at like lethal risk.
Yes.
Right? And so part of that practice means that if somebody calls us and says, oh, you saw Susie Q, and we want to know what you talked about, I can neither confirm or deny that I talked to Susie Q.
Right. Us too.
Right? And
Yeah.
so it's also that.
We
and
can't
then,
even say that we've ever met Susie Q, and I
Right.
imagine it's the same for you.
And with the VOCA and VAWA protections that I talked about, there's also an additional protection on any like therapeutic or counseling notes as it pertains to any legal proceeding. So like in a criminal case or a civil case, like order protection or family court, our therapeutic notes are protected double because of the Victim of Crime Act.
Now, is that because you get federal funding, or is that for anybody?
We get federal funding for that. That funding that we get is administered from the Victim of Crime Act.
So you have to, so you have a different level of accountability, it sounds like.
And protections.
Interesting. So when an offender is arrested and they're going to be released, is there a legally requirement of the corrections facility, the jail, to notify the victim?
Yes and no. Yes, because that is one of our requirements federally. However, when we talk about resource power and the ability to make it so, New Mexico usually doesn't have the manpower, according to corrections agencies, to make those calls. So what we do is we rely heavily on national hotline numbers in order to help us with that. So I can't think of the agency at the top of my head, but there is a victim notification nationally that we will actually set up clients with and teach how to navigate it, so that if that person gets released, there is a automated call that the person will get and says, you know, this is so and so is going to get released, and it is unfortunately like it's within a couple hours they get it. Or I've actually heard some other sad news that victims were getting notified after the offender was released, and you're like, well, what was the point of that?
Yeah.
So I think that the system is really striving to try to do better, but there are those little gaps that we still see specifically.
So just to clarify, the victim has to register in order to be notified, or just take their chances? It's more likely that they'll be notified if they register?
The system, the jail that the person goes to, the abuser is arrested to, has a duty to warn. But if they do not have the resources in order to warn, what my agency does is we try to do the second fail-safe of registering them to that national program, and I'll get it for you.
Yeah.
To try to register for notifications. That's our goal.
Yeah. I guess you can never cover too many bases, right?
No.
The more you can do, because that's when that offender gets released, that's really, you know, the stakes are really high and the acuity level really increases, you know, because of the obvious.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes that can be a deterrent for the offender to act out because they don't want to get into more trouble and they want to stay out of jail, but not always. Sometimes it can go in the other direction where they're angry and upset and vindictive. They want justice, you know.
Well, yeah, when you think about like power in itself, and this is any type of power, like any, you know, corporate structure that has CEO on the top, has all the power. Power itself it does not want to be relinquished. Like, it'll do anything it can to survive.